Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our week of true crime in ancient times at the Getty Villa Museum, which houses our collection of antiquities. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm very happy to be hosting this talk by my colleague Eric Bruehl. I'm going to do a couple of brief items of housekeeping and then move right on to the fun stuff. This program is being recorded and it will appear within a few days on our true crime webpage where you registered probably, and you'll find a watch button instead, and then it will appear on the Getty's YouTube channel. Please ask questions in the Q&A panel and start as soon as they come to you. Just have fun asking anything that you think of as Eric is talking. I'd like to move right on to introducing Eric, who is my colleague at the Villa. He's been at the Getty for 20 years. Eric has a BA in classics and archaeology, classical archaeology from the University of Michigan, and he also has a degree, an MA from UCLA. So he's a fellow archaeologist, and it suits him greatly to be at the Villa. He's excavated at many sites, and he has many interests, including death and humor, and also the ways people warn each other off, which is what he'll talk about today. So, Eric, handing over to you.
Thanks very much, Shelby. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Getty this week for College Week. We hope you're enjoying the selection of events that Shelby and her team have put together. Always impressive. And I especially hope you're enjoying the true crime theme of the week. Since it's College Week, I did just want to give a quick shout out before I begin to my alma mater. As Shelby mentioned, the University of Michigan. If there are any of you watching this, go blue. And also shout out to UCLA, where I was at grad school here in Los Angeles. So go Bruins. All right, so today we're going to talk about some Greek curses in the Getty's collection. Now, how does a museum acquire or collect curses? That's a question we're going to be looking at in a moment, but I have another question before that, actually, that might be better suited for this week, which is, how does a curse, or how do curses fit under the theme of true crime? Well, so here's the explanation I gave Shelby in order to be able to talk about this topic this week. Very often, the most important part of any crime can be the intention behind it, right? What the police would call intent, perhaps. Well, what is a curse but a request with intent, sometimes to harm? And oftentimes this intent requires an accomplice. So I'll give you a very simple example of this. The phrase, and pardon my language here, "God damn it," is usually said out of anger, perhaps because you've stubbed your toe, maybe lost a bet, or just received some bad news in general. Many of us have probably muttered this phrase from memory without considering what is being asked or even commanded using this phrase. So in essence, you're invoking a deity to damn or curse something or someone even so that harm or evil befalls them. And if that doesn't sound like a premeditated attempted crime involving an accomplice, then I don't know what does. So let's take a closer look at how we understand curses and how they might be true crime. So, of course, the curses that we're most often familiar with are much more innocuous in nature, right? So I have two examples here from a while ago in the 20th century, the mid-20th century, popular film in 1957, The Curse of Frankenstein. We're certainly familiar with other films that employ the word curse. The Curse of the Mummy comes immediately to mind. So for the most part in popular culture, when we think of curses, we just generally tend to think of something more ephemeral, if you will. And even those kind of curses, on the right side of the screen here, you'll see an old football card of a former Detroit Lions quarterback, Bobby Lane, who was unceremoniously traded by the team after winning a championship with them. And on his way out the door, cursed the team, saying they would never win another championship again. And so far, he has proven to be correct. And this also happened back in the 1950s. So when we think of curses, we generally tend to think of this in terms of popular culture. But curses take on a different aspect, a downright nasty one sometimes in antiquity, in large part because the curses actually require the curse and the cursor and the curse to believe in something supernatural, or more commonly, magic. And ancient myth was full of this type of magic. If you looked on the left here, you'll see John Waterhouse's painting of the goddess or sorceress, the goddess of magic, sorceress Circe, who is offering Odysseus a cup of potion while one of his men in pig form lies at her feet. He is the unfortunate victim of Circe's magic. In the mirror, you can see Odysseus taking this scene in and moving with trepidation and clenched fists. A believer and a survivor of magic, Odysseus recognizes the extraordinary power of the goddess and her magic and remains cautious. This is exactly the type of deity one might invoke to enact a powerful curse. And on the right side, you have the famous Laocoon group, which reminds us of the many instances of magic and curses from the story of Troy, the Iliad. The older man in the center, Laocoon, is surrounded by his two sons, and he is a Trojan prophet who warns the Trojans that they must not accept the Trojan horse gift left to them by the Greeks. Because with this warning, he has offended Poseidon. Poseidon sends sea creatures that envelop him and his sons and drag him out to sea, cursed by the gods for his prophecy. And which reminds of another Trojan prophet, Cassandra, who was cursed by Apollo to always predict the future accurately, but then nobody would end up believing her. So another example of the power of curses in ancient narratives. Now, as you can see from these examples, I mentioned several gods. So ancient religion and magic were closely intertwined. As a matter of fact, in most ancient religions, the gods were believed to act directly upon human affairs, almost like magic. Therefore, it was necessary to supplicate them with offerings and dedications, and so that their blessings would be beneficial in nature. This is a really cool example of that. This is an Etruscan votive offering. Votive simply means something deposited or displayed in a sacred place for religious reasons. And this statuette represents a male torso, as you can clearly see here, that looks like it has been basically split from breastbone to pelvis. And you can see on the interior the internal organs that are exposed. Now, this isn't a completely accurate replica of the human anatomy, but it's pretty darn good, and it seems to suggest that the Etruscans, at least, may have had some understanding of internal anatomy. And whether that came from observing butchered animals or perhaps observing the mortally wounded on the battlefield is unclear. But this votive offering, and oops, let me just go ahead one slide. This votive offering is further indicative that the Etruscans understood the anatomy not only of males, but also of females. And this wonderful example of a votive uterus, perhaps deposited to assist in the pregnancy process, or maybe as a token of gratitude for a successful pregnancy, is again indicative of this understanding of anatomy. And these devotional models would have been presented with a prayer, perhaps. As I mentioned, it's unclear if these votives were used necessarily as a request for healing the afflicted part of the body that was being dedicated, or if they were perhaps an expression of gratitude to the gods for having healed the body part that was afflicted. But what we do have here then is a request to a higher power for something good, or perhaps a display of gratitude for something good having happened. But however, sometimes you wanted to turn magic away from you because it was evil and not good. And so that's when you used powerful or turned to powerful imagery. And as you can see here, powerful imagery could look goofy. You've obviously, I think most of you have probably heard of Medusa and her Gorgon sisters in all likelihood. And it might surprise you to learn that the Gorgons were popular images on engraved gems and on, as you can see on the left here, other decorative objects like this mirror. Their appearance was thought to protect the wearer by frightening away evil spirits. Medusa is apotropaic, which just means she's able to ward off evil. And there's a bit of dissonance between the ancient idea of warding off evil and our more modern idea, where we kind of tend to think in the Western world, in the Judeo-Christian world, that in order to defeat evil, it takes good. The ancient Greeks and Romans simply felt that a more powerful evil was all that was needed to ward off evil and curses. And since Medusa was one of the most cursed of ancient beings, how couldn't she also be the most potent? So you see her face, like I said, on these decorative objects intended to ward off evil, kind of the opposite of curses. So on the left, she's shown on the back of a hand mirror, which you can imagine if you hold it up to your face and look in the mirror. This side is pointed out away from you in order to ward off malicious spirits or any evil. And on the right side, she's depicted on a small scarab, on a little amulet, which would have been worn around the neck, potentially to ward off disease. And these amulets were worn in the belief that magic, that religion could potentially be protective. Along those same lines, this insignificant looking stone on the left is also a protective amulet. On one side, there is a variation of a very common magical incantation. The name, and this is going to take me a minute to read, Ablanathanalba. Ablanathanalba. See if you can say that. Ablanathanalba is a formulaic name that would have been used in magical spells, and it's not too different from the formulaic name of abracadabra that we're actually still today used to associating with magic, and which also originated in antiquity. On the other side of the amulet, a protective prayer for the amulet's bearer is inscribed, which says, "Deliver Gaia from fever." But since part of it is damaged, there's some expert consensus that the entire inscription would read, "Deliver Gaia from the fever and also the chills and from all her headache." This would have been owned perhaps by a young girl, as the infant mortality rate in the ancient world was extremely high. It also further encouraged confidence in magical spells to ward off illness and injury. We'll also see that they could be used to attract illness and injury. But for this reason, you see the boy on the right who wears a leather necklace around which a leather necklace, at the end of which is a small container, which would have held amulets. For protection. His hair is shaved in the style of a devotee of the goddess Isis in Egypt. And in all likelihood, those amulets would have borne some similar type of inscription or imagery of the goddess or the deities that he worshipped. And while the young, or the parents of the young, invoked protection from death for their kids, those who reached a certain age before they passed often invoked let me start that again. While the young or their parents invoked protection from death, those who had passed or who'd lived to a certain age before they passed often invoked protection in death. And here's a great example of a sarcophagus panel from the Getty belonging to the wool merchant Titus Aelius Evangelus, who apparently made considerable amount of money as a wool merchant. He displays some of the trappings of his profession on his sarcophagus panel, and you see him reclined in the center of the panel on a couch, kind of enjoying the successes of his life. What might be a little bit harder to pick out is that there is an inscription written in the background above him and actually below his couch that reads, "That there be after me and my wife no other person inhumed in this sarcophagus. I forbid it. Whoever reads this inscription, which I have made for me and for her, let him pour unmixed wine for Titus Aelius Evangelus, a patient man." So what's interesting here is the warning, if you will, or we're moving into the realm of curse here, that Titus implies in his inscription. This idea that someone might be buried in there or that someone might vandalize the tomb, he forbids. And the implied nature of Titus forbidding something is an idea that even though in death, his forbiddance should be frightening enough and potent enough to discourage would-be vandals or looters. So you have this forbiddance by a mortal man who in death takes on somewhat supernatural powers in order to dissuade, or I should say a supernatural potency in order to dissuade, like I said, vandals or looters. This next object is a little more specific in its intentions and punishments, and depicts a young man by the name of Poseidon, who is walking to the left, followed by his diminutive wife. The woman appears to be holding a pomegranate, which is a common Greek funerary symbol. And with his right hand, Poseidon points down to where a dog, a hunting hound, was originally located and brightly painted. He's dressed in kind of hunter's garb. But the most fascinating thing about this grave marker, about this stele, is the inscription, which is written on the wall behind Poseidon and his wife. It's very difficult to see in this image, but it reads, "This memorial of Poseidon, son of Heraclides, this is the memorial of Poseidon, son of Heraclides, a righteous man, and he wronged no one ever. And if anyone has the power to see and speak good, to him may the gods be gracious, and may he do nothing wrong." And here comes the good part. "And if someone desecrates this memorial or these plants or figures, if someone should carry into this memorial any other body except mine, that of my wife, my sons, or my daughters, and if someone should carry off this memorial for the purpose of sureties, or should himself buy or assign to others, or carry another body into the tomb, unless specified by me, and if anyone either perpetrates despiteful treatment or exerts physical force on this monument, then Artemis, Medea, and Ephesia, and all the gods," and here's where this curse is frustrating. The verb is missing here, but he ends by saying, "Artemis, Medea, and Ephesia, and all the gods," verb, "him and his descendants." Now, I will let your imagination run wild with what the gods could potentially do to a looter and his descendants. Artemis, Medea, likely refers to an incarnation of the famous sorceress who helped Jason in his quest for the Golden Fleece, and was legendary for her power and her retribution. And she's actually a niece of Circe, whom we saw earlier. It's unclear exactly who Ephesia is that is being referred to, but the conjunction with the phrase "and all the gods" may suggest that she's a powerful deity in her own right. The name is not uncommon in Asia Minor, so there may be a more regional element to the deity as well. But again, what we don't know, unfortunately, is what Poseidon has requested that the gods do to any trespassers. It certainly doesn't sound like something good. It certainly doesn't sound like he was saying, "and all the gods reward him and his descendants." But it's likely that something like causing someone to perish would have been the verb that is obscured there. Now, curses from beyond the grave were all well and good, but what did you do when you needed to curse someone in real life, right? One of the objects available to you, or one of the options available to you in that regard, were curse tablets, as they're commonly known. These small, thin sheets of metal, often lead like here, sometimes gold and silver, generally soft so that they could be inscribed. They're also known as lamella, which refers to the thin metal sheet itself. And on them, dedicants, let's say, would write, or presumably pay someone to write, a curse, and then perhaps imbue it with some magic potency through a special ritual or through the use of words. These sheets were then folded over several times or rolled really tightly and deposited in sacred locations, temples, graves, landmarks, what have you. And as you can see, this one shows the markings of having been folded, and indeed it has 2 nails driven through it, which is also not uncommon when seeing these curse tablets. It's unclear as to why perhaps these nails have been driven through it, although it's been suggested that the piercing of the physical object may give the request some added potency. So what does this one say? And to be honest, it's pretty grim. It starts by naming 5 slaves: Philocumus, Antiochus, Parnicus, Sosus, Erato, and Epidia. And then it requests that may they dissolve, may they not find satisfaction with their masters, these same whose names are here written. May they perish for the reason that they also might find satisfaction with their property. And may the things said and done by these be consigned to the underworld. It sounds like it's a pretty wicked curse, and it's slightly humorous until you realize that this is actually written by, in all likelihood, a slave wishing harm on several other enslaved peoples who have been recently rewarded, and likely it is in order to gain their possessions. One article I read called this professional jealousy. I think that's definitely understating what's at play here. But I think what is important to note is that this is a curse tablet that comes from what would have been considered one of the lowest social orders in Rome. And it's a reminder that this magic is available to everyone, not just the elite, but also those who are enslaved. And this is, in some ways, the only way some people can fight back. So curse tablets were used for a range of reasons, and could vary from the extreme example here that we saw to a more simple wish for justice and or restitution. Indeed, one famous curse tablet notes that a man named Vario, whose cloak was stolen, requests that whoever stole his cloak be deprived of his property and be reft of his mind and his memory. He goes on to say it would also be nice if worms, cancer, and maggots penetrate his hands, head, feet, as well as his limbs and marrows. So sometimes justice and retribution looked differently than we might think of it today. And finally, we have this stellar curse tablet. They were also known as defictiones, which is the word I have highlighted there. And if you look closely at this, and hopefully you can see it, you'll note that the writing takes up almost the entirety of the surface of this tablet. The time and patience needed to inscribe something like this likely rendered the curse or the spell more powerful, or at the very least would have cost more to have made. The inscription is what is known as a binding spell, sometimes, especially in older literature, known as a love spell. Really nothing, there's nothing to do with love here. This is a binding spell intended to attract women to a, in this case, sex-starved man. This is the, I guess, ancient version of incels trying to attract attention from the opposite sex online. But I will also argue that this binding spell is also a curse, at least for the poor intended victims. Like I said, this dedicant is trying to attract the attention of women, and not one woman, not 2 women, not 3 women, but 4 women. And he's doing it by summoning a spirit from the underworld. So I'm not going to read the entire inscription, which you can find on our website if you just copy in the title of this object into the Finder. But to give you an idea, to give you an excerpt, the dedicant calls upon the dead spirit to bind 4 women to him, and he prays, "Let the gates of Hades open up for me, and having raised him up, send up to me among the spirits of the dead under your control, that single deceased soul bound by fear and trembling. For it is required that he, after ascending, should serve me in this very hour. Bind and burn, ignite, inflame, and fetch for me Postuma, whom Tertulia bore, and Tertullina, whom Flavia bore, and Perpetua, whose sons are Volusius and Faustianus, and Candida, whom Successa bore. Summon them for my lust and passion for Gaius, now quickly, through whole nights and days, driven with insane passion, desire for my love and for my lust. So in this wonderful inscription, which is at the same time horrific, you see really the gamut of Greek curses. A dedicant who acts in his own interest, the invocation of a higher, presumably in this case, somewhat malicious being to help him achieve those interests, and the unfortunate intended victims of the focus of the text. So, if anything, this Lamella, this curse tablet, reads almost like a confession letter. And if anything unfortunate had befallen the intended victims, I believe we have here very strong evidence about how it may have come about. So I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion on Greek curses and Greek curse tablets and the like. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them or try to answer them.
Thank you, Eric. So we have some questions here for you, obviously, because of course. One of them is if the material the curse was written on matters either to the power of the curse or to a specific god or goddess.
Oh, if the material matters, I see what you're saying. Like I mentioned, for purely utilitarian purposes, softer metals were preferred, and for inscription purposes. And it certainly would have been the case that a lamella of gold or a lamella of silver, which presumably would have cost much more to have fashioned, would have been thought to be more effective, to be more powerful. You do find a lot of lead curse tablets, a much easier material for, let's say, the average Joe to acquire. So I can't say for certain if the material necessarily added potency, but certainly the value of material, knowing the Greeks, knowing the Romans, the value of the material probably did in some minds. In some minds, convince them that this would be more effective, say, than a lead one.
Probably, if a god is influenced by religious application of votives and other kinds of persuasion, then it would help to have high quality gifts.
Right, but we don't want. We want to. I was just going to say, but they want to make sure that they wanted to make sure even in antiquity not to cut off that avenue to the gods, so to speak, by just using these expensive metals. So votives certainly vary in quality.
Eric, do you know if there's a curse used by a slave against an owner that we've found?
That's a great question. I am off the top of my head. I cannot think of one. But I mean, they must have existed in massive abundance. I would think in antiquity. It's a great question, and that's probably actually the first thing I'm going to look up after this.
I can't think of one either. I mean, we have weird hordes of curses and miscellaneous curses, and obviously if an owner ever found out, then not only the person but the curse tablet would both disappear. But that's a really interesting idea.
It's a great question.
You have a question by the same questioner about what your favorite mythological curse is. Do you have one?
That's a great question. I'd have to think about that, because it probably wouldn't be necessarily a mythological curse, but it would probably be a curse attached to an actual historical figure from that time period. You read about specific Romans or Greeks who we said we're cursed for one reason or another, under some kind of, under some auspices. So it would probably be that, but I can't necessarily think of one offhand. Just from the presentation, I always thought that Circe's magic was really bewitching, actually, to use that term, and that was only, I think, made even more the case by that recent Madeline Miller novel about Circe, in which the sorceress is really given a lot of life, and takes on a rather new. I took on a rather new perspective of her. So yeah, turning someone into pigs, I think, is not a bad curse. That's a pretty good one if you have that power.
I think my favorite is House of Atreus, not just because it was a curse, which doesn't totally fit because it doesn't get written down, but because feeding your children to the gods is just so dreadful that it doesn't even need any kind of action except the will of the gods to make it happen.
Yeah,
There's a question about.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. We're on a slight time delay, so we talk over each other. I apologize. So finish your thought.
I was just going to say the eating of children. I talked about Medea in this presentation as well. Those are about as bad as it can get when it comes to being cursed.
Everybody seems to feel the same about that through all of human history. That's probably a good thing. Does the way that a curse is written down matter? Ink inscribed in metal, languages, invented words, all those things. That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a great question, though. I don't think we can say for sure how it mattered, but we can certainly, I think, suggest that it must have mattered to some extent because, like I said, some of the incantations are formulaic. So the idea is, that they would, to be effective, they would have to be used properly in exactly the way that they were laid out. I think, to some extent, as we were talking about with materials earlier, inscribing something in lead versus maybe writing something on papyri might have been, considered to be more permanent or more potent. That said, we have hundreds of papyri from the ancient world with curses inscribed on them. So that seems to have been, a valuable material as well in that regard. But yes, word order, formulas, the formula of the spell, the material that it was written on, all seems to indicate that, there was, let's say, real thought put into how these cursed tablets were going to look.
A related question is how they're presented, as it were. Were they buried? Were they saved and used at trial? Were they always hidden? Were they left at temples? Or lots of different ways, or any sort of standard approach to cursing?
I think I think you made a point earlier. For some of these curse tablets, you don't necessarily want them being found. These are, when you're wishing ill upon someone, especially death, so you could potentially take their belongings, you're probably going to put this in some kind of sacred space, and you're going to do, I don't know, bury it potentially, cram it in between, a crevice in two walls or some stone. I think in some instances, certainly, you wouldn't necessarily want these discovered, so you might deposit them in a way that would prevent people from stumbling on them, so to speak. I'm trying to think of the example that comes to mind. I'm totally blanking where this wall is, but a wall where people stick small scraps of paper with wishes on it, and it says your wish is supposed to come true. So you just kind of cram it in between the stones there, and some of these maybe not necessarily always the curse tablets, but certainly some of these, let's say, prayers or spells would have been, would have been deposited, let's say, with less subterfuge. But the sheer ubiquity of these objects around the Mediterranean, suggests some type of deposition, but not necessarily not necessarily a permanent one, let's say.
Eric, do you know of times when curses worked? I mean, people thought they did, or recounted that they did, or acted as if they did.
Achilles is an easy example, who's prophesied, if you will, to die in a specific way, and you can use the word prophesied, or you can use the word he's cursed to die in a specific way. You could argue he was cursed to die young. So that's not necessarily a historical curse; it's a mythological curse. But obviously, like I said, ancient literature is just completely full of those types. And
it seems as though people believe them. Whether they get actual proof that it happened may be something that isn't recorded except mythologically, which is interesting and helps promote belief without the need for proof. Because if you really are worried about this, it'll work, or you think it will. And if it doesn't, it'll be for some explainable reason. Do you think there were any differences in belief about effectiveness of curses across social strata or education? That there was any kind of making fun of people who believed in this kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, it's again, I think we, you only have to look at society today to see how, if you believe something supernatural or what we might term superstitious, you could potentially be a target of ridicule. And it was certainly probably the case, we know it was the case in antiquity. Shelby, you had mentioned, level of education, which is something in antiquity that would have been very, very especially in Roman antiquity or Greek antiquity, with its emphasis on hierarchy, which would have been something that would have been very much noted. So the kind of idea that the uneducated lower classes were gullible, were superstitious, were prone to believing things that the educated elite classes knew not to be true or believed not to be true, that certainly existed.
It seems as though people were pretty worried about their graves in general, and that warnings about your funerary equipment or your burial spot are not uncommon, even if they're not super common. Do you think that that's just a common fear across all of human history and time, or is there a particular Roman focus on this?
Yeah, I would say, I would say to some extent the former, but definitely to a great extent the latter. The Romans, especially, and you can see from the memorials that they make, which tend to be oftentimes large in size when possible. The Romans did believe in this idea that their funerary markers, their memorials, what have you, were really what lived on about them in posterity. So, the human is gone, but the spirit can be remembered, and the person can be remembered through this physical object, oftentimes made of very strong material, very strong and durable material. So, going to, this type of effort to memorialize someone with what could potentially be an expensive marker or an expensive sarcophagus, you did have a vested interest in, that stuff not getting repossessed or repurposed by someone else for other usage. And we know from the number of inscriptions that, that warn others not to reuse my tomb, not to put other bodies in my tomb. That this must have happened. You say it's not regularly, but it must not have been uncommon. And this kind of possessiveness of your final possession, I guess, is something that, especially in the Roman upper classes, and especially in actually what we might call, even though this didn't really exist, the Roman middle classes. This desire to really be remembered by virtue of your memorial, or your funerary memorial in perpetuity, was strong enough that you wanted to take all kinds of safeguards to ensure that nothing happened to your marker.
There's another good complicated question about whether there were specialists in writing curses, or to what extent general scribes would take it on. And I would assume that on a sarcophagus, a regular carver of inscriptions on sarcophagi would just do that. But on metal amulets, or metal or lead tablets, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. A sarcophagus inscription is something any chiseler, could do. But those inscriptions too aren't necessarily imbued with the quote unquote magical potency of some of these other objects. So in the case of these curse tablets, where you are literally directing your energy, your in this case ill intent, at specific people or a specific person, that requires magic, that requires outside help. And so witchcraft, sorcery in the ancient world is actually a fascinating topic that is not very well understood. But the short answer to that is yes, there would have been probably someone versed in these spells, also literate, to whom you would have gone in order to add potency and power to the curse. That person, just by their person, would add some level of potency to this, and makes these objects like not very comparable to, say, the inscriptions that we find on sarcophagi.
In converse to these kinds of curse tablets, do we have benedictory tablets in the same sense, wishing well for people? I mean, maybe in a religious context, healing context, like your votive. But do people actually go on wishing each other well in the past, or is it mostly, hey, I'm going to curse you?
That's a great question. The curse tablets are called curse tablets for a reason. Those are generally curse tablets, but with the votive offerings, we see examples of trying to curry favor, let's say, or great gratitude for favor. And as far as curse tablets go, I don't know of any, or as far as tablets. My initial instinct, and I'd have to look more closely at our own lamella, the gold lamella, but my instinct would be that the lamella that do guide the deceased into and through the underworld, those could kind of be seen in that light. And there are examples of lamella that seem to belong to devotees of a particular religion that address, here's what's going to happen when you die, and here's where you need to go when you're in the underworld. So that might be the closest that I'm really familiar with, more of a general, I guess, concern with the spirit than the body when it comes to the lamella.
Eric, someone brought up something that sort of addresses other questions about whether people think they were cursed or not. But way out of your lane, it's about Tut's tomb and how the tomb was theoretically cursed, and then the dramatic deaths associated afterwards with the cursing um, fit the description of a curse. But
Totally.
how does this relate? Do you think? Does it relate?
Okay, well, yeah. I mean, I think it definitely relates because I think it just goes to show how we haven't come that far, so to speak. That coincident, and hey, I may be completely bashing Tutankhamun's curse here, and myself feel the wrath of that at some point, but these were likely coincidences. Everything that kind of happened in the aftermath to the excavators, explorers of the tomb. But obviously, it fits in nicely with the idea of a curse, especially a curse coming from a tomb that had, previously been unopened for thousands of years. Um, it The Tutankhamun curse, I think, was one of the first Ripley's Believe It or Not comic books I ever read, and it certainly had me believing in a curse when I read when I read that comic book. But the more the more you kind of read about it, and the more read about it historically, the more and the older you get, potentially, the easier it is to believe that these were just unfortunate coincidences that could be romantically tied back to this idea of an ancient curse. So I don't know. I'm kind of outing myself as a skeptic here, but I will say it certainly does make for a much better story than than if not.
I don't know if you have a list in mind, but there's a question about, and then we're going to start winding down with the last couple of questions, about cursing a certain aspect of life, of a person's life, like their food or harming their animals or their children and things like that, really specific that hurt them in a way that doesn't necessarily help you, except that you're causing them pain. Can you think of a curse like that? Well, I don't even know if I'm totally asking this question properly, but basically, how specific can people get in these curses about details of what should happen?
Super specific. Yeah, they can get pretty darn specific about how they want injury or illness or what have you inflicted on someone. And I mentioned just briefly the inscription from one of the Lamella, in which the man who has his cloak stolen, says he wants. Let me just find this. He wants worms to invade the body. Where is this? Yeah, he wants worms, cancer, and maggots to penetrate his hands, head, feet, as well as his limbs and marrows, like the bone marrow. So here you have, three very specific weapons: worms, cancer, and maggots, and 5 or 6 specific body parts that this dedicant wants affected. So, yeah, and it could be the case, as we saw in the case of the slave, in the case of the curse tablet by the enslaved dedicant, that people could be covetous of other people's property as well, and you could very easily go to someone and pay them to write you a curse tablet that wished ill on the person with the property so that it might become yours. So yeah, I think the that's actually kind of the charm of these curse tablets, to an extent, is sometimes the specificity is, it's pretty amazing and pretty mean spirited.
Yeah. And that brings us to the very last question, which is probably pretty complicated, about if there are divinities preferred for helping with curses.
You can certainly summon particularly potent beings, kind of with a target in mind, so to speak, with whom you want in mind. That last example of this underworld spirit coming up from Hades to help with the binding spell is a good example. The word, makes it sound like they're conjuring a demon from hell. That would be kind of our 21st century analogy. But yeah, with spells, and that's really the beauty of these spells and these tablets, again, is that kind of specificity where you could acknowledge exactly who and how they were intended to be hurt. And then you could also summon someone, your accessory, if you will, specifically, if you knew anything about magic or if you knew anything about curses. And in all likelihood, depending on the kind of curse you wanted to, the kind of curse you wanted to enact or start, you went to an expert who would prepare it for you and tell you exactly whom you needed to invoke.
That reminds me to bring up Pazuzu, because we just had our Mesopotamian exhibition depart, sadly, and Pazuzu was the demon in The Exorcist, and so he was very much a factor in cursing in that movie. But in fact, he was, although a hybrid being and pretty scary looking, he was just he really helped quite a lot in keeping his wife out of people's business. She was much much more likely to cause trouble than he was. So I think there were endless possibilities for who you could get to help you in different
Mm-hmm.
regions, cross culturally too. Eric, this has been really fun. Thank you so much for taking the time with us and introducing us to these objects in our collection that many people don't know are associated in this way with cursing. I hope many of you can come and visit them here, and also that you can join us for many other events of true crime in ancient times this week. So thank you for joining us, everyone. And Eric, thank you. And we'll all see you later. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.